Welcome everyone to Winnipeg ProPride. Thank you. I'm Jade Pichette. I'm the Director of Programs at Pride at Work Canada, and I use the pronouns they, them in English and elle en français, ella for the Spanish speakers in the room. And we try to make our spaces as safe and inclusive as possible. So I've been really grateful for all the people who have been masking and making use of their masks in between moving around. Thank you so much for taking care of our disabled members of our community, and also, have those times where you're unmasked, eating, getting to know the people that you're close to, and some new folks as well. And also, everybody's putting on the stickers, which is really great. So for those at home, those in person are putting on stickers, including their pronouns, and also either a green rectangle for come talk to me, let's chat, let's interact, a yellow heart for I'm here, but let's have a little bit of distance, and then red circle for I just need some space. I've seen lots of greens today. I'm a green as well, so please feel free to come up and talk to my green rectangle self afterwards. And thank you for keeping our community safer. So I also want to recognize today, as we start, that we work on the traditional territories of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. This includes Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ Indigenous people, and we recognize that there are multiple barriers that impact Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA+ Indigenous people in accessing meaningful, affirming, and inclusive employment. And so if we're not doing the work to do that and bring down some of those barriers, we're not doing our jobs. And so I'm here for the first time in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, and I'm really grateful to be with all of you and to have gotten to interact with many of you through the conference on Treaty 1 territory, which is traditionally the home of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. I've also been grateful to be drinking water, as have many of you, through this conference that just ended, the Human Rights Conference, because I know a lot of people were there, as well as those who are just present right now. And our water is being sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. And so I want to recognize that and think about that in the work that we do, and even in the small moments. So I also want to thank our sponsor, which is the Canadian Museum of Human Rights, which we are currently at. This is such a beautiful venue. Big shout out goes to Haran, who may or may not be behind the sign that I can't see. Yep, right there, who you may have met at registration. The museum came on as a partner of Pride at Work Canada about a year ago or so, and we've been really proud to start to work to make this as inclusive a place as possible. And a really big shout out to them making our washrooms all gender and inclusive for all, which is very exciting. It's not easy to change facilities, so it is a big deal. But to actually start us today, I would like to welcome up Elder Albert McLeod. I am so honored that Albert is here with us, who will be giving a few remarks. Albert is a Status Indian with ancestry from Cree. I messed this up virtually as well. I am so sorry, Albert. And the Métis community of Norway House in northern Manitoba. He has over 30 years of experience as a human rights activist and as a director of the Two-Spirited Peoples of Manitoba. Albert began his Two-Spirit advocacy in Winnipeg in 1986 and became an HIV/AIDS activist in 1987. He was the director at the Manitoba Aboriginal AIDS Task Force from 1991 to 2001. In 2018, Albert received an honorary doctorate of laws from the University of Winnipeg. He lives here where he works as a consultant specializing in Indigenous peoples, cultural reclamation, and cross-cultural training. And I am honestly honored to be on the stage with you, Albert. I have seen your work for years, and it's been an inspiration for me, even though this is my first time in this territory. The impact of your work has been felt much further. So I'm so grateful. Welcome.
So welcome everyone. As I've been saying over the last week at the different conference activities, this is my home. And I originally come from the Pas, Manitoba, a small town north of Winnipeg that was really about Canadian colonization. Not only did my family work in the Hudson Bay fur trade as part of the development of our nation, our economy, our capitalism, and our resource extraction for over 250 years. On the Woodland Cree side of the women who worked in the fur trade, as well as the men from Scotland who came here as young men to work. And this is about work, employability, safety. And for me, growing up in the North, our family were a Métis family, not, considered the best quality of family in those days, in the 50s and the 60s, certainly seen as second and third class people. And by the time I was 12, 13, I understood I was a homosexual person in the style of Rock Hudson, the old classic gay homosexual person. And that created quite a lot of trauma for me, trying to find a path of existence within the anti-Indigenous racism, the classism, the segregation between First Nations and Métis peoples, heteronormativity, patriarchy, masculinity, and being gay, feminine youth in the northern community. Imagine that. And then traversing, adulthood by becoming employed. And I remember my first job was a bag boy at a local grocery store. I was very proud of that. And I began to learn about the benefits of, being involved in society, particularly through employment. And I memorized my social insurance number, and I still know it by heart today. Should I say it? It's taboo to do those kind of things. But again, that was my first exploration of independence and being employed. And so I stayed in there till from 17 to 19. And when I was 19, I got out of there. It was too toxic for me. I knew there was no avenue for me in those days. And that was 1975, 76. And thankfully, art education saved my life, literally. At the age of 19, I left my home to come south to Brandon and take commercial art, as it was known then, pre-computer days. And I met other youth who hadn't gone what I've gone through in terms of the isolation, the depression, the anxiety, the fear. They had been raised in Canada proper, right? And they didn't have that baggage in their spirit, in their mind. And I was fascinated by them. They were like shiny Barbie dolls to me, the other youth I engaged with. And so it was really a great experience for me in this liberation process. And so through my art, I made myself employable. And, I worked in the HIV/AIDS field for many years and still do. And art has been the mechanism of communication around HIV, just as it has been for COVID, right? In terms of getting the message out about health. And that English has limitations, biomedical knowledge has limitations, So in many cases, it is how we communicate visually, particularly now with this new technology of cell phones and Facebook and TikTok and all of that. And so art has been my foundation of my career and still is. And it's a place to go when you're frustrated with systems, with bureaucracy. The art is replenishing and rejuvenating for me. And certainly in the Indigenous community, as we've come out of this pandemic, many Indigenous people have become independent, self-employed people. And we see the resurgence of beadwork. We see the resurgence of the ribbon skirt making, powwow regalia. And I want to give you an example, because powwows were sort of restricted early on in the spring of 2020, and the powwow circuit in North America is huge. And people go from Canada to south to Texas, up north to Saskatoon, the powwow trail. So what happened is they created a Facebook group called the Virtual Powwow Trail. Today it has over 240,000 Facebook members. And it has brought a community in North America, but from other parts of the world together during this pandemic. And many of those members have their own art that they promote and they sell and create their own economy. And that's how they've survived. Coming back to Manitoba and living here for many years, I've done some advocacy with our provincial government back in the day. And this is with regard to murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And that history of colonial, incremental, and genocide that we carry ourselves as a legacy of that colonial period. And it is still active in Canada. 3 women, Indigenous women, were murdered in Winnipeg in the last 10 days. And that's a reality, right? So I had an idea. I was reading the letters of my grandfather, who was a Hudson Bay factor. And in his letter, he thanked his wives, who were Woodland Cree women. He said, without these women, I would not have had the success that I've had over my career in the Hudson's Bay Company. And both his wives never spoke English. They only spoke Cree. His first wife died when she was 24, leaving him with 3 children. Her older sister was recruited to help him with his children, and he later married her. And she was the grandmother I knew. She was born in 1897. When I was born, she was 58. When she died in 1990, she was 93. And she was my mentor. I watched her as a child when she would smoke moose meat to make pemmican, when she would tan hides to make moccasins and jackets and mucklucks for us for winter. She would show us how literally to make bows and arrows. You may not believe this, but this is true, that my grandmother knew, because she had many brothers, and how Cree children were shown how to literally make bows and arrows, and she did that with us as a child. And I watched her smoke fish, and she was my, ideal in terms of industry. And a lot of that work she had done is not really credited as being valuable to the origins of Canada, but it was truly how Canada came to be. So I wrote a letter to the Premier at the time, it was an NDP government in Manitoba, and I said, we need a bronze statue of an Indigenous woman in our legislative building to acknowledge the contribution of Indigenous women to the founding of this province and of this city. So I got a letter. Thank you, Albert, great idea. We'll think about it. So that government fell, and then we had another government following them, Conservatives. Wrote another letter to that premier, same content, writes a letter back. Thank you for the idea, Albert. Well, think about it. Then last summer, there was a march on Canada Day, marking, the founding of Canada as a nation, and there was a group of Indigenous people who were marching from the Forks, where we are, down to the Legislative Building. And a group of them split off and went to our Legislative Building, and there sat a prominent statue of Queen Victoria, an empire builder, the Empress of India, right? And they put a rope around that statue and pulled it down, and it fell to the ground. On the side of the building, the east side, Queen Elizabeth II statue was also pushed forward. And they said they could hear the sound of her nose hitting that sidewalk in the neighboring apartments. And I think that's what we're talking about in the work that we do around pride, human rights, and being queer in this country. It's not an option, right? It is about the freedom that our ancestors fought for, to live in the 21st century. And hopefully our governments listen to us, particularly Indigenous people, about honoring our leaders and our heroes in our parliament, but as well as in our legislative buildings, and acknowledging the contributions of Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people to the founding of our nation, and that it was not a patriarchal process, and that there are stories that need to be told. There are statues that need to be seen as a part of this legacy and this history. So that's the work I do in the community, is to remind people of our obligations about justice, equity, equality, security, and safety in all places, particularly the workplace. There are many Two-Spirit people in this nation who have been barely employed for their whole life and are now in their 60s. They do not have a house, they do not have a vehicle, they do not have life insurance, and they certainly don't have a pension, right? Because they haven't experienced that. And there was never an intention that they should in this country, that they experience that quality of life, that privilege of life. So when we talk about Two-Spirit people, we have to realize there is disparity. There is a history of racism. There is a history of discrimination. There's a history of unemployment intentionally by the state in this country. And we have to learn that history to be fair, to know what we're doing, to know what we're planning, just as we are today when we talk about safety in the workplace. There was a woman who was hurt in the North End here, and we were talking about the services she needed. And the worker said, well, we could get her an apartment or a house to live in. And I said, you're assuming she's had her own house, she's had her own apartment. Maybe she never even had a bedroom with a door on it. Maybe for her whole life, she never had any privacy. And you want to put her in an apartment or a house, not understanding that trajectory of her life and what she's gone through to where she is today. So when we move forward with the inclusion of Two-Spirit people as we decolonize and reconcile, we have to go on that journey of learning together. Not only the history of non-Indigenous peoples in this nation, whether you're from settler history, a refugee, an asylum seeker, an immigrant, but also that of the Indigenous peoples on this land. So in the invocation, we call in spirit to join us today, to listen to us, to see us, to guide us and help us if they can to do this work, to move forward in a good way with a strong heart with conviction, with courage, with ingenuity as we move forward. And I want to share with you before the next speaker comes up, because we were here at the morning talking about the Purge Fund and then the LGBTQ2 Purge Monument in Toronto. And I managed to collect 3 business cards. And one of them is mine. I'm self-employed now. You can catch me at albertmcleod.com. And I became my own employer. And I also have the business card of the well-known Sven Robinson. It's kind of a fancy one. And I also have a business card here of a friend of mine from Ontario. Her name is Leslie Maria Lee Cam, and she's not here this afternoon, but she was here earlier. And this is what her business card says. Queer, lowercase, dyke in caps, and community activist in lowercase again. So these are the business cards we need for the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Albert McGuitch. Feel free to join us here. We also will need a handheld mic, by the way. So in the meantime, my computer died. So I'm, very grateful for the remarks that you just made, Albert. And I think some of the things that come through for me is how do our concept, our theme this year for Pride, ProPride, is resurgence. And, we need to think of creative ways to resurge as community. And sometimes that means doing it independently. Sometimes that means, creating a small business. Sometimes that means being able to, fund and choose to work with indigiqueer, two-spirit organizations and small vendors, if you have that power in your work. We have to think of all of these different pieces. And as I've been here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory, I can tell how deep resurgence is within the fabric of the people here, within the city as a whole. The strength and beauty that I see through this city and all of you who live here, I've been grateful to glimpse a piece of that. As Albert said, earlier this day, we talked about the purge, which led to many 2S LGBTQIA+ people being excluded, losing their livelihoods, and in too many cases, lives. During this pandemic, many have also saw the loss of life and isolation, where we found closets to go back into, but it was for the sound of our Zoom meetings. Come on, that was funny, please. As we come back together, I know we see hope. We see pride in our lives, in our workplaces, in the moments that we connect with one another. And I'm really excited to introduce our executive director, Colin Druhan, who has helped build this organization up significantly. And over that time, I'm not going to read your regular bio. Over that time, when he started in 2014, we were a very small organization. We had 1 staff, which was him, and at the end of the day, we now are looking at 16, and most of those are permanent because of the work and connections that Colin has made, that other staff have made over time. And so I'm very grateful to introduce someone who started with a degree in oil painting and has since gone on and gotten a certificate from Harvard and Rotman's Business School as well as being named a Diversity Fellow by Civic Action and much more. So welcome, Colin, to the stage.
Thank you very much, Jade, and thank you, Albert, for your story both this afternoon and this morning. As Albert said, many of us were here to hear about the LGBT Purge Monument, as well as the history of the Purge. And I would really like to just point out that I started in 2014. We actually have McLeod, who is one of our founding board members, who started Pride at Work Canada in 2008. And just a round of applause for Martin as well, please. It's just a group of volunteers that started Pride at Work Canada to respond to many of the legacy of challenges that our communities have faced, that Albert talked about, his decades of experience working with our communities and the history beyond. The folks this morning talking about the Purge. These are not issues that are in our rear view. They're directly in front of us. Pride at Work Canada, we see it every day. We just did a great piece of research with SRDC to locate some pretty devastating statistics. We did find out that there is indeed a significant earnings gap for folks based on sexual orientation. For just example, heterosexual men in Canada on average make $56,000 a year. Bisexual women on average make $26,000 a year, less than half. TransPulse Canada tells us that more than half of trans folks in Canada make less than $30,000 a year. So we have work to do. These are really tough problems that go beyond just being able to put a picture of one's partner on your desk at work. And when the pandemic started, I was quite scared. I mean, I think we all were for a number of reasons. But Jade talked about once being the only staff member, and when I started to see the kind of markets fall and the direction that a lot of company finances were going in, we started seeing a lot of bounce back emails, people being laid off. I was worried, not just for our mission, but at that time we had 4 staff members who the success of the organization was, that's where they made their living. So I was worried. I had a responsibility. We had to really make sure that we were going to be delivering services to our members and holding on to them to make sure that they stay with us through the challenging times of the pandemic. And I have to say that, we had the best possible asset in Jade Pichette. Jade was our manager of programs, developed innovative ways of presenting our programming online, engaged thousands and thousands of people over 2020 and then 2021 through virtual programming. And my worries just melted away, because our revenue at the beginning of the pandemic was $600,000 a year, and we just closed our financial year with $1.6 million in revenue. And to Jade's point, we're not using that money on fancy parties. That's what the museum is for. They're here hosting us generously today so that we can spend our money on those 13 new jobs that were created through Jade's innovative approach to member services for the 250 partners we have at Pride at Work Canada. So we really, really do appreciate, Jade, all that you've done for the organization, all that all of our staff have done. I don't need to tell the folks in this room that when your personal identity is attached to the work that you do, you don't get to just take it off like a jacket at the end of the day. You take that home with you. So, all of the folks who work and volunteer with us, that's who we do it for, Jade and I both. And we're just so grateful that you could be here with us today. I just got back from Halifax, and that's my hometown. I was there speaking at the Canadian Apprenticeship Conference. And I left Halifax 20 years ago because I did not see a future for myself there financially. And I was lonely. I didn't have anybody I could look up to from queer and trans communities. I didn't have any mentors. So, I wish that I could go up to that kid that I used to be 20 years ago and tell him that it was going to be okay, and say that as hard as it might be to imagine, you're going to be back in this city talking to 400 skilled tradespeople about how you need to get more queer and trans people in good union jobs, and they're going to applaud you, and they're going to come up to you and say, how can I help? But I can't, and you can't go back and talk to all of those kids that we used to be, but we can do that now. We can make sure that everybody in our communities has a champion like Jade. That's how we get through this. That's how we do our part to bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. Thank you.
Actually feeling emotional. It's been a really powerful week. And when I was working on the program for this event, I didn't know this community, right? And I was getting to know this community. I was looking online. It is very hard to organize an event in a city that you have never been, that you've never lived in, and also do the city justice too. And not just say, we're gonna bring in speakers from Toronto, they're gonna say their thing. That's not what I want. And I came across somebody that many of you in this room already know, who has done such amazing work. There is blinding lights in my face. Uzoma, you're here, right? Yes, thank you. So MLA Uzoma Asagwara, who uses the pronouns they and them, and yel en français, is a politician, registered psychiatric nurse, and activist. Uzoma is an addiction specialist, registered psychiatric nurse, educator, entrepreneur, mental health advocate, and now NDP critic for health, seniors, and active living. Uzoma has volunteered in leadership positions with several organizations, including Queer People of Color Winnipeg, the Women's Health Clinic, and the Plug-in Institute of Contemporary Art. Uzoma is a former basketball player with the University of Winnipeg and the Canadian national basketball team. Uzoma is a progressive and compassionate advocate for social justice, climate action, equity, and positive change for all families in Manitoba. They also represent a lot, and I know how much that can mean to be put on your shoulders when you are a representation and a figurehead in many ways. But you are showing that there is possibility for others, especially other non-binary people, in doing this work. So I'm so grateful. Give a big round of applause to MLA Uzoma.
Hi, everyone. How are you doing? It feels much, I guess when I say that like you're right here, it feels like a very sort of warm space. It feels like a very familiar space in a way. So I hope you'll indulge me. I'll probably share a few personal things as well during my talk. Is it okay if I, thank you. Thank you so much. So it is so nice to be here with people from all aspects of our communities. I'm not sure how many of you folks are feeling, but certainly the pandemic, I think, took a unique toll on queer communities, that the impacts of isolation were felt pretty uniquely and specifically for folks who oftentimes don't have access to spaces in the same way. And so certainly for someone like myself who in 2019 started a new role in public service as a politician, I don't like that that's first in my bio, that we have to change that. It's like, I feel like that should be last in the bio of things that I do. I would like other things to precede that. But, a big shift going from being a nurse and a community organizer and activist and moving into the role of being a legislator. And then very quickly, after September of 2019, we were in a pandemic. And, it's this talk and what we're here talking about specifically around the resurgence of our communities and specific to the workplace and different workplaces is really, really, really important. Because the reality of it for our communities is that We've been targeted and marginalized out of workspaces long before COVID ever reached any of our borders. And the other tough reality is that COVID did not suddenly make that go away. It in fact made it much more challenging. And Manitoba is a unique jurisdiction in that during the pandemic, we did collect data that was specific to race. We collected race-based disaggregated data, and that was an effort that was led and championed by the First Nations pandemic response team here in Manitoba. And folks like Dr. Marcia Anderson, who just won Doctors Manitoba Physician of the Year. These folks made sure that data was being collected that should have allowed for the government to make really informed decisions and put forward strategies that would protect the people who, without the data, I think a lot of us in this room would know we're at greater risk of having poor outcomes related to COVID, but certainly the data made explicitly clear that Indigenous, Black, communities of color were even more impacted by COVID. And unfortunately in Manitoba, you have all this great work being done, all these efforts being made, but there was a lack of that political will to take that information and put it to action as quickly as needed to protect people, to equip people with the tools and resources they need to stay safe. And one gap in the data that was identified and one gap in data that exists is data specific to queer and trans two-spirit communities. And I really appreciate that you talked about a stat that the data is being collected in terms of pay disparities in our communities. But when we talk about the workplace and how do we make things more equitable and make sure folks have opportunities, I think about something that a friend of mine, Sane Dubé, said during the pandemic during an interview. My friend Sane used to live in Winnipeg, but she abandoned us. She left us, and I hope Sane sees this recording somewhere. She left us here in Winnipeg for Toronto. The people go to Toronto and leave the city. I don't know why. Winnipeg's amazing. If you're in Toronto and hearing this right now, come to Winnipeg. Leave Toronto, come to Winnipeg. It's great here. But she said something in an interview that really stood out to me. And she works in population health, public health, and she works specifically around the health of Black communities. And she said in this interview that you can't fix what you don't measure. And that really stood out to me because it's true. It's one thing to say that we all know there's an issue. We all know that there's a lack of representation of queer folks, trans folks, two-spirit, non-binary folks, the spectrum of identities within the workplace. It's one thing to identify that, but it's another thing to understand what that really means and looks like. And if we're not collecting the data to assess it, how are we ever going to meaningfully address it and develop strategies to address it? So that's one area that comes to mind when I think about these particular issues. Something else that, the why comes to mind. Why are we even talking about this? I think we all know why we're talking about this. It's the right thing to do. It's morally the correct thing to do. It's about equity. It's about justice. It's also what makes workplaces better. There's been so much research, there's so much information around, how do we make workplaces better? How do we enhance outcomes? You bring people of all kinds of experiences and backgrounds and perspectives into these spaces, and it improves things. It just does. So to me, that's kind of a, neither here nor there. That's a fact that we know. But when I think about all of the conversations we have around, moving forward as we get through this pandemic and making sure people have access to opportunities and, making workplaces more diverse, EDI, that whole thing, which just honestly makes me bananas at this point. Seeing EDI absolutely everywhere, but there's a lack of actual in-depth conversation around what all of that means. There's a lack of conversation around what it means when we talk about inclusion and who is being centered in that, as if everyone else is like just an addition. Who are we centering when we talk about inclusion? We really need to make sure we're talking about the spaces that we're asking people to advocate, to diversify. We really need to talk about safety. Fundamentally, we need to talk about safety. Because it is one thing for all of us to talk about, and for the general public and companies and organizations to talk about, we need to diversify our workforce. We need to make sure that we're all about equity, and we'll get the stats and we'll do all of that. But what happens when folks are there? What happens when folks are in those jobs and in those works? What happens for us? Is it a safe environment? Are people going to stay? There's a reason why when we look at organizations of all kinds, nonprofits are being put on blast very recently for this. This very museum went through listen, I think everybody here, if you don't know, go on the Instagram, and there's a page there. I can't remember, it's Canadian Human Rights Museum. Stop lying, thank you, somebody knows it, yeah. I am proud of the person who brought those issues forward. She is so strong and she is so amazing. And the reason why the incredible work that is being done now at this museum is being done is because somebody spoke up and said, what this place is supposed to represent is not happening. And the very folks who should be centered in this building are being harmed. And even though she's not here, and she's probably not watching right now because I know that she's working actually, can we give her a round of applause, Tiane? Because when you look at organizations, and again, like I said before, nonprofits right now are being put through it. When we look at businesses, companies, et cetera, the folks who say they're making a lot of efforts to diversify a space or a workspace, the further you go up in that establishment, in that organization, what happens? What do you start to see? It gets really, really white, right? What we're still seeing is that even the efforts being made to make workspaces more representative and diverse, there's a real issue where folks who have the most power, the most influence, decision-making, policy-driving ability are not the same folks who we're saying we need to have in these spaces in order to make our organization stronger, in order to improve outcomes. And there's reasons for that. And that's where that work of creating safety in these spaces is so important. If you can't retain people long enough to be in a workforce, how are they ever going to skill up, get the experience to even access those opportunities? It's not going to happen. So, when I think about the realities of this, it's a lot of heavy lifting. It's a lot of heavy lifting, but it's all tangible things that can be done, that are being done, and that should not fall solely on the shoulders of people who have been targeted to the point of marginalization and navigate systems of oppression every which way they navigate their lives. That is an unfair expectation and responsibility to place on people. It is the folks who have more privilege, who have greater access, who do not carry as heavy a load, who need to do the heavy lifting. And accountability needs to be attached to that. So, when I think about employment and barriers, I think about my own personal experiences. I remember when I first started looking for a nursing job, my first, career gig, and I'm not trying to flex on my own self, but I had a pretty good CV, like I did. I think I had a pretty shiny resume. I felt pretty confident. And I was like, yeah, I've been volunteering in healthcare spaces since I was a teenager. I've worked in healthcare as a nursing student. I got fantastic grades. I can clearly juggle, athletics and being on a national team and making sure I still get my degree and my education. I was feeling pretty great about my chances. And not only could I not find a job, I couldn't get an interview. I could not get an interview. I couldn't get a job close to where I lived. I ended up getting a job very far away from where I lived. And although I was, used to taking public transportation, that's how I got around everywhere, I wasn't used to having to take like an out-of-city bus that ran at very specific times in order to go to the job interview and then maybe get myself home. And I didn't think I'd have to spend money I didn't have to buy a vehicle I didn't want to go to a job that I could barely get because nobody else would interview me. But that was my reality. And I could talk at length about what it meant when I got into the workplace and how so many experiences I had were the catalyst for me doing work within healthcare to make the workspaces safer, to make sure that not only were people receiving care that was dignified and respectful and that centered their identities, but that people who were providing care had those experiences too. It wasn't long after I got that job that because I couldn't get a full-time job, that was part-time, that I got another job. I was working 2 jobs then. And not long after I had, actually it was maybe a year or so into working that job, maybe longer, that I was just chatting with a supervisor one day. And casually, like nothing, like talking about how she liked her coffee, she told me that when they were interviewing for the position I now held, that she had come across my resume, and that because she didn't want to have to try and pronounce my name, she had taken my resume and put it to the bottom of the pile. She said it like nothing. That really opened my eyes, right? You know discrimination is real, you know these things happen, but it's those kinds of decisions, because someone perceives an inconvenience of kind, it's racist, but perceives it to be an inconvenience of some kind, that the opportunity goes from being right there to being the bottom of the pile. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of heavy lifting that targeted folks have been doing for a very long time. Really and truly, if we're going to ensure that this resurgent, that these spaces are truly moving in the direction of equity, there are folks that need to start doing the heavy lifting in a meaningful way. And, you know, as hard as it was to hear that detail, it was a reality that gave me an opportunity to confront what that means, to really get into dialogue about how that's not okay, and how do we prevent that from happening. And you prevent things like that from happening. One, you can do a lot of training. We all know about the EDI training that's out there now, and a lot of folks doing great work in that way. But we actually need policies in place. Policies, laws, all of these things are the ways in which rights are respected, can be protected. And so talking about policies can often be very boring. I love policies, quite frankly. I love drafting policies, making policies, but it sometimes can be, getting in the weeds of it can seem kind of boring. But I will share one more personal example about the importance of policy. So shortly after I was elected in 2019, they sent out letters to all the new MLAs asking us what our preferred salutations would be. And I hadn't really given that any thought. I didn't expect, I've never been elected before. I don't know what's going to happen. I was like, I don't even know how to do this job, figuring it out every day. They send out this correspondence and identify your salutations. Well, here are the options in 2019. Mr., Ms., Miss, Mrs. Those are your options. Blew me away. I couldn't believe those are the only options they had available. My response was pretty quick. None of these work for me. Can I not just use MLA Asagwara? I'm thinking, how is this not already on the list? And they were like, yeah, of course you can use MLA Asagwara. And actually, we're going to make sure that everybody can use MLA and then their name moving forward. We're going to make sure that that's a policy going forward, that these options never get sent out again in this way. Great, right? That's one step. That's one change that should have happened forever ago, but it's in place now. And that change happens, and I'm sure we can all give examples of changes that happen in different workplaces just by being there in your identity, by being there and being able to articulate and express that this is who I am. Just being there. Took a lot to get there, mind you. I could talk about the campaign process, but I won't. That will also probably be boring. Some exciting parts, but I won't get into that right now. But just being there and saying, yeah, I'm a non-binary person. I use neutral pronouns. It's not an accommodation they have to make. It's not an inconvenience. It's a right. It's a basic human right that needs to be upheld and respected. And that to me is the importance of this talk around resurgence, that each and every member of our community should be able to access the opportunities that they want to pursue as their whole selves. You should not have to walk into the door of any workplace and leave part of who you are outside of it. Your whole self should be able to walk through. The last thing I want to share is something that happened fairly recently. It's been happening actually since I was elected with certain folks, but there was an incident recently. So, being misgendered happens. Folks use non-binary, neutral pronouns. Folks of all pronouns, all identities can happen. Not okay, we need to respect pronouns, basic human right, not an inconvenience, not an accommodation I'm asking you to make, respect pronouns. In my experience in the legislature, there have been many times where I've been misgendered, unfortunately. There have been some times where I would question whether or not it was accidental. And there was an incident recently where it happened in the chamber. And because of the pandemic, everyone's enhanced their virtual capacity. The legislature is no different. It's enhanced, which is a good thing. It gives people greater access to what's going on in those walls in the chamber. And on this particular day, this particular moment, it was pretty awful. I'm just going to be honest about that. It was pretty awful. Typically there, it always is, but this incident in particular was not, it was terrible. So I knew in that moment there were steps that I was going to take. I had already done the conversation thing and, all the things that we do to let's, make sure people are on the same page. But it was clear, greater steps needed to be taken. Now, my plan was to write a letter to the Speaker of the House. Details, it's just the person who is supposed to maintain the parliamentary behaviors, decorum in the chamber with the MLAs and people in there. Before I could write my letter, which I did write it and send it, people from the general public were already writing the Speaker. People were pissed off. People saw the incident because it was, someone else clipped it actually, because we're now much more accessible, and posted it on social media, which was not my comfort level. It was a moment for me that was very hard, as the moments had been to that point, but that moment in particular was really tough. And, it's not my shame or embarrassment to carry at all, but I couldn't help but feel a little bit like, people are really going to see how awful that moment was now, publicly. But that was necessary, quite frankly, because people saw it, people were upset, and people spoke out, and people called in, and they wrote emails, and they demanded accountability. I did as well. And a couple of days later, the Speaker made a statement in the House stating very clearly that everybody must respect the pronouns of anybody in the chamber. And it was a lengthy statement. I did not expect it actually to be as clear and as resonating as it was, but it actually set precedent that had never happened before in a legislature across the country. That set precedent. And so that moment of feeling uncomfortable and frustrated and all the things for myself, and then having that be made more public, was a moment for me where I was reminded of what it means to do community work, what it means to advocate for spaces to be safer, that we do it collectively. It's not an individual effort. We're not alone in any of those moments. Actually, we're not alone in what it is, the heavy lifting that we're doing. Because I fully believe that it was the pressure from external folks, from folks in the community, writing in and saying, we see this, we see you, we demand better, we expect accountability, that really helped make that difference. And that is now precedence. That is now a policy, in a sense, that is to be adhered to. So, I wanted to end on that because I wanted to, make explicitly clear here that we need actual laws and policies in place, that we can do all the advocacy, but we need to make sure fundamentally rights are protected in those ways. And that, those moments where we think we're feeling alone and we can't do that heavy lifting by ourselves, we're not alone. We're not doing the heavy lifting by ourselves. We are a collective. That's why there's folks in this room at this conference from everywhere across the country, which I think is pretty cool. There are people here in Winnipeg right now from different parts of the globe. That's amazing. And so, these conversations are critically important moving forward, but it's also critically important that we're looking at it from as many angles as possible and demanding that the people who should be doing heavy lifting are accountable to that as well. So I think I'm going to leave my remarks there. And I want to thank you folks so much for the opportunity to be here, the opportunity to connect and talk. And I wish everybody well. I know that things are still, it feels great to be in spaces, but I don't know about you, I still have moments where I'm kind of like, eh. So as we move through this stage of things, I hope that we can make sure we stay connected in doing so. Really grateful to have the opportunity to connect with you folks today. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, those remarks, Uzoma. I think it's things that would resonate with a lot of people, and now you're starting to convince me that I should move to Winnipeg. So, so I know everybody on this stage, and probably most of you in the audience have experienced this harm that can happen in work, whether it's finding work, whether it's getting work, whether it's keeping work, whether it's just existing in your workplace. And so, Uzoma, you finished on the connection and the community and the space that brings. And I want to put it out to the three of you of, for those who are struggling to find healing from the pain that they've experienced from work, for those who are struggling to find community, to find that connection, to find each other, what would you advise them to say, and how do you think that people can find that healing, can find that space, can find that connection in community?
Well, that's a really great question and a very important question. And, so often when we talk about these experiences, we're talking about pain, we're talking about trauma, we're talking about challenges. Being queer, being non-binary is so lit. It's like such a joy, really and truly. Embracing that and understanding that aspect of myself when I got there, and I'm still learning about those aspects of my identity and who I am, is the best thing ever. And so in the face of all the challenges and the pain and everything else, I always encourage folks to find healing in not just addressing the pain and the trauma and everything else, but leaning into joy, leaning into what makes you special, leaning into what gifts you have, perspectives you possess that other people don't. I feel sad for other people. You're not queer? Sad for you. You're not non-binary? Sad for you. It's so fantastic. And lean into people who celebrate that, who want you to be joyful, who feed that part of who you are. It is healing to be present in joy. It is healing to recognize that who we are as a people, as peoples, is rooted in joy. And so that's what I try to communicate to folks.
Yeah, I think, we've been at the Human Rights Conference at the Radisson Hotel, and as well as the Purge Advisory Council's been here this week as well, and some of them have been part of this conversation this week. And the Fruit Machine was showed last night, and there we saw that pain, that trauma, that grief, by the ones who spoke, the Purge survivors, of what happened to them. And it is unbelievable. And because they were in an institution of civil government, the military, the civil service, and the RCMP, what other groups would not follow legislation, laws, and policies? Yet, for the queer people, all of those were abandoned so that they would be searched out and ultimately fired and lose their job. lose their place in their life. And really that's what they talked about, mostly the lesbian women who went through that, who shared their story in that documentary. And it clearly shows that it's not just about being fired or losing your job. It's the psychological, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual trauma that is the legacy that the employer does not see, that these people have to carry for the rest of their life. And you know, kudos to the ones who shared their survival in that video so we could learn from it, right? For myself, I follow a model that was developed by long-term survivors of people living with HIV and AIDS. And they devised this, and it's about assumptive loss. And it can be related to the pandemic because in the spring of 2020, we all assumed we had a world that we were living in, that we were very comfortable in a future that we knew existed. Yet that was derailed within months. The government said, oh, this will be over in October 2020. It was not. And neither was it over in October 2021. And we're just now coming out of that. So what happens is your assumptive world. Oh, really? Wow. Okay. Maybe we got 15 minutes. Anyway. So really there is. There is a strategy. Those survivors of the AIDS pandemic have left us a roadmap of it coming through this trauma and how you do it. You recognize and validate that what was done to you was wrong, morally, ethically wrong, regardless of the situation, and that it was discrimination. Anti-gay, it was homophobia and transphobia. It can be covered over any way you want, but in your mind, in your psyche, you acknowledge that for yourself, that it was ethically and morally wrong. And you are angry about it. And you have the right to be angry and express that anger. And that's why for the murdered and missing Indigenous women and Two-Spirit, that's why we have Idle No More. That's why we have the vigils. That's why we have the marches. That's why Queen Victoria and Elizabeth II hit the ground last year. Because you have the right to be angry because you have been wronged. And then it's about understanding your assumptive world is gone. And it's clearly in that documentary, The Fruit Machine, that their life journeys were entirely disrupted by what happened. And that they've managed to pull something together, pull their self-esteem together, their healing, to be employed again, to feel safer again, to work again. But with the understanding that the harm is still there, that legacy will not go away ever, I don't think. Matrine Roy was here earlier, was one of those survivors. What I saw in that video was the visceral pain, the trauma, and the tears. And they were being interviewed and they could not hold that back because it is a psychological, spiritual experience where your body reacts to that trauma and you cannot hold it back. And the tears came, right? And so you restructure your new world. And clearly in the video, it is about their new path, their new journey. And it's okay to do that. It's okay to change your direction, change your career, whatever it takes to get out of that and see yourself in a new way, a better way, right? And in the end, it's about going big or going small. Some people go small, and some people, like those purge survivors, went big because they put their face in that documentary to warn us and tell us to be vigilant. Right? They went big because that video is a national documentary, right? That will continue to be seen over the next 50 years. And that comes at a cost. That takes courage and integrity to put your life experience in the public eye. And so we really need to acknowledge that courage and to acknowledge those who go small, you know, that they move on, they're okay, they don't need the limelight, but also acknowledge those who go big and really take notice of what they're saying, right? And to continue to be advocates, demand justice, and be vigilant. You know, we had the cowboy convoy in Ottawa, I don't know how many weeks now, and that happened in our lifetime. You know, the weather, the unprecedented weather, unprecedented fascism in our capital city. And we got to witness that live on television. And we took it, right? But for me, never again will that happen in this country. Never, not while I'm alive. And I will stand up to that racism, that homophobia, and that transphobia. And it is what it is. It's fascism, right? So I just want to share that with you guys.
What more is there to say? Thank you, Albert, so much. We all benefit from your knowledge every time you speak, and just very thankful that you could be here with us today. So thank you very much. And thank you for your personal stories as well. I think sharing our own experiences, I think, is one of the most powerful ways of showing folks their humanity. And I think sometimes when we are discriminated against, it's because they forget that we are all human. So thank you both very much.
Thank you to all three of you. I think due to the time, we're going to come to a close for today. To all of you who have been tuning in online, thank you. I hope you've heard these words and you talk about them and you take them back. You talk about the moments of joy, you talk about the moments of pain, you talk about the learnings that you got today, and the powerful words that were said on this stage, which I was grateful to be here for. So on that note, I want to say thank you to the Canadian Human Rights Museum for hosting us today. We have already talked about maybe next year coming back and doing something even bigger together. And really do look into the work of the Purge. If you don't know what we've been talking about, Google the Purge Fund. And if you're one of the folks in government, in one of the government institutions we work with, that's tuning in today as well, go check that out, because there's plenty of really amazing recommendations in there in terms of how we make those workplaces more inclusive from a public service perspective. And there's plenty of learning that can go into every organization within that as well. So I've been so grateful to be on this territory with you all, to have shared space with you all, and to see this as a start of something new and also a returning of something old. And so at this point, whether you're coming out to others, coming into yourself, or coming back, thank you for being here. Thank you for being moments with each other, because sometimes it's those small moments and those people who go small, in addition to those of us who go big. So thank you all, and happy Pride.